Good afternoon and welcome to the Planning Commission Special Call Meeting on November 6th. Can we have a roll call, Shannon?
Messina.
Here.
Fleming.
Here.
Ingalls.
Here.
Lutrip. Mandel.
Here.
Rumpler.
Here.
Ward.
Well, I guess we can just stand and do the pledge.
Yeah.
Why not? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. We have two items. One is an administrative item, which would be our first item on the agendas. So, Hillary, you doing it? Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, Commissioner. So I'll start, and then we have the applicant's representative here, Phil Boyd with Welch Comer. And so
Okay.
he'll go into a little more details, and either of us will be available to answer questions for you.
All right, thank you. Oh, excuse me, and we have any sign-up sheets or?
We do not. So this
Okay.
is being handled as an administrative interpretation, and so the ones we've all done in the past, it's not a public hearing. There is an action item, though, requested of you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. So just a little bit of background and kind of the decision point before you today is really that Hagedon Marine Group, they have been working on expanding the marine operations consistent with the PUD that was approved by the Planning Commission in 2016 in conjunction with the annexation request. And they have done some additional work on designing that dry stack boat indoor storage facility and realize that there are some physical constraints on this site. And so that necessitates some adjustment to one of the setbacks along a portion of the shoreline. And so I'll show you a couple of exhibits, and then as I mentioned, Phil Boyd will be able to show you some additional ones as well and provide a little more context into this request. But so just wanted to show you the decision point is really for the commission to decide if this is consistent with what was approved in 2016 with that PUD 3-16. So the first image, if I can get there we go. This is really just an exhibit from the PUD that you approved, and so it's kind of showing the different areas of the PUD. And the subject area we're looking at right here is kind of in this red circle, the highlighted area. So the PUD was allowing a 60-foot structure within that area, and there was a 40-foot setback from what is the shoreline. The unique part of this is the Blackwell Slough, and it's been dredged, and so this is not a natural shoreline like other parts of the river or the lake. And so this is definitely unique, as well as the fact that they own the underlying land. And so this is treated as a taxable parcel. It is not, again, kind of a true waterway. And so those are some of the different nuances. The setback here is this request to get an additional 15 feet closer to this kind of man-made shoreline in order to build this boat storage area. And so there's some issues with some of the utilities here along Marina Drive as well as on this side, and trying to kind of make the whole thing fit and function. And so again, Phil will kind of cover more of those details, but there's no change in the request to the height. So 60 feet was allowed before, it's still going to be 60 feet. It's just how it fits within this area and a little bit about the size. And then this exhibit shows one of the permits that's already been approved for the project by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And as you can see, it allows them to dredge and go onto the property where this red line shows, which would be further than they are planning to do and would go into where they're looking at doing this dry stack. But just to show kind of the context of, we don't truly have jurisdiction of this man-made shoreline anyway in the marina, because there's other agencies that are involved in doing these permitting things. And so while we have the ability to look at a PUD and approve it, there's other jurisdictions and agencies out there. And so I think this is really important to show, and this is one of the reasons staff supports this being an administrative interpretation request, is because this could severely change what's already been approved for the PUD and would really kind of change what exists now for the shoreline. So lastly, the decision point before you is, for you to determine, again, if this requested modification to the setbacks along this small section of the waterfront would be necessary to allow for them to build what's already been approved for this dry stack boat indoor storage facility, and if that's consistent with what was approved with that limit design PUD in August of 2016. And with that, I'll let Phil go into a lot more detail on kind of the request and the background and the marina operations, unless you have any questions for me first.
Oh, John?
Thank you. This project, does the size of it trigger a design review?
It does not. So these are kind of their supporting facilities, and so it does not trigger design review. They do have to meet the commercial design guidelines, and that's one of the things that Phil will talk about, is that they're proposing some additional mitigation to the building to improve the design of that and go above and beyond what's required from our existing commercial design guidelines. But it will just be reviewed by staff. The existing design has already been approved by staff, but they would be adding some other details, as he'll show you on some of those exhibits that are included in your packet.
So, Commissioner Messina and I sit on design review, and one of the things that we would see there frequently is, blank walls and mitigation for blank walls and things of that nature. And so those are very positive, I'm seeing in this. And those wouldn't otherwise be required.
They would not. And so that's one of the things that you saw in the applicant's submittal was it's already going to be a large building. And so they're asking for this reduction, the setback, but they're actually proposing to go above and beyond those commercial design guidelines and add windows on multiple locations on the building to break up what would be seemingly a kind of a blank wall. And then also adding a trellis feature to also provide more of kind of a living green component.
So I was truly trying to understand that this is truly a bonus. We wouldn't expect to have those mitigations provided otherwise, because
Right.
design review wouldn't trigger that requirement in this case.
That's correct. And
Without-
staff had already approved a design with less details that met the commercial design guidelines. So this is a bonus that's going above and beyond.
Thank you.
You mentioned other jurisdictions, three
Yes.
other jurisdictions.
So
is that the
Department
state?
of Lands
Okay.
is one of the other ones, and I'm not sure if there's other, I'll have to let Phil speak to that, but I know at least those two agencies have issued permits for
Okay.
the project.
So the Army Corps of Engineers. So
Yes.
the other jurisdictions are comfortable with all of this then?
Yes, because I
Okay.
don't believe this affects, I think they're going to do some modified permit request to the Army Corps of Engineers, but, yep, let the applicant's representative speak to that.
Okay, thanks, Hillary.
Thank you. So which one is it, this one? The one below it. There you go, okay. You were welcome. Trade your place.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. Phil Boyd with Welch Comer Engineers, on behalf of the Hagedon Hospitality Group, and John Barlow, who would normally be here representing them, but he's out of town, so I'm in his stead here to walk through this. So as Hillary said, the objective today is to demonstrate the need for the reduced setback and then provide the commission with a justification for the dry stack facility. So to do that, I want to walk through the dry stack configuration. Why do we need it? The second part is the justification for the reduced setback. And then, as Hillary mentioned, the proposed additional facade improvements in consideration, we'll say, for that. So I'm not certain how many folks know what a dry stack is about. We've talked about it before, but just briefly, I'll go through what the function is. This is a rendering of the proposed dry stack, the original configuration. 2 large doors, several hundred boats stored inside. This is the plan view of what it would look like, and you can see there's large aisles here, and boats are literally stored on racks. You drive a big forklift in there, pick the boat off the rack, and go drop it into the water. In the center, there's actually 5 racks. The peak height here is less than 60 feet, so we're below the maximum. And the eave height is at 55 feet, under 55 feet. And so that gives you a little bit of an idea. We have 4 racks on the eave. We had to keep those lower in order to get our drainage in there. As Hillary mentioned, that's the location for the dry stack. You can see these are the service buildings that were built a few years ago, the existing docks and the sales center and sales buildings in this area. The point is down here where the Cedars is. I've tried to orient the drawings north, so I'm sorry that the text is rotated, but we're all kind of used to seeing north as up here. So as Hillary mentioned, the setback the reduction we're looking for is 15 feet, and it's not a willy-nilly reduction. We've actually worked really hard to try to not have to be here. The challenge is Avista has a buried power line here that services all of the island, as well as buried gas line. And on this corridor here, the city has a buried water line that is about 14 feet deep, and the Avista has a buried gas line in that area, and will soon have buried power in that area as well. So the idea of shifting the building towards Marina Drive presents a significant challenge, because we would have to relocate the utilities. And one thing to think about is if you envision a column right on the end of that building right there, that column will it be beyond the building facade by about 5 or 6 feet, because they're such big columns. The footings get very large. So you can't just look at the envelope of the building. The footings actually go beyond that. From a functional standpoint, the way that a dry stack works, as I mentioned earlier, you go in, pick a boat out, back out with a forklift, come over to here and drop it into the water. The area that you see over here are valet docks. Your boat would be pulled over, parked in that. Off the screen here, there's a proposed building that you would come, wait for your boat, get out, walk down, or be driven down this ramp, and then walk down, jump into your boat, and leave. So it's a way to essentially add a marina without having to add a marina. And Chairman Messina, I'm glad to answer questions as we go, if that's
Sure.
appropriate.
Sure.
As Hillary mentioned, some of the justification for this is the shoreline's a little bit, I don't want to say nebulous, but maybe we'll say fluid. It could be fluid. Currently, Hagedon Marine has a permit to move the shoreline back to this location, which would obviously not be terribly advantageous. But we could also go in and apply to move the shoreline in the other direction, in this direction, into the slough. It would have to go through a permitting process. But there would be some trade-offs that we would be able to give up, namely not doing this big expansion here. And this was a permit that was secured several years ago. The current direction of Hagedon Marine is that they're not going to head down this path. And certainly if they build that dry stack, they won't likely move the shoreline. But that's one of the ideas, is just that the shoreline is a little bit fluid in this area.
Is there dredging required to even meet this standard?
To achieve what we're talking
That
here,
line there, yeah,
there's dredging required to
achieve that,
achieve that, which it's a permitted,
right,
they have a permitted dredging permit for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
okay.
The other one that's a little bit interesting is actually the original shoreline. And so we went back to a bunch of old drawings, old photographs, to try to determine where was the shoreline before. We kind of know some of this because we come across strange things when we're digging out there and scratch our head and say, I wonder where this came from. This is an old drawing that shows where the shoreline was originally. I superimposed roughly being able to pull off the original highway alignment, because this is where 95 originally crossed the river, and it ended up on Rosenberry or the Dike Road. So if you kind of align yourself there, that's where it
You were looking at me like I'm old enough
that
to
you
know
were there
this,
at the
right?
time?
Yeah.
That wasn't intentional. So this demonstrates where the dry stack would be with respect to the shoreline, about 80 feet from the original setback. Another interesting thing is you can see there's this peninsula of land here, and this was dredged at some point, but if you connect that peninsula with this peninsula, you kind of can identify where the shoreline would have originally been. Here's a couple of old photographs that demonstrate what the land use looked like in there. The water looks much wider here, but it's primarily because the water's up. If you look over here and you see all the trees submerged, that this area, it's probably during some sort of high water event, and back in this time when went and took out a picture out there. But they're still interesting to see the use that was historically there. You can kind of see the railroad went through here. The dry stack would be in this area. This is a current picture that shows where the dry stack would be set in here. Hillary mentioned also the justification for, another justification is that the waterway is privately owned. It is a unique situation, but Hagedon Hospitality pays taxes on that particular area there. So one way to look at it is the shoreline setbacks that are on public waterways don't necessarily are the same here on a private waterway. She mentioned that the PUD, we actually put the open space through the private property, because you obviously can't have open space in a public property, so we put it through in the private property, and that was approved in the original PUD. So we think that there's several justifications for it, but even still, the Hagedon Corporation had made this idea of, well, if we're gonna ask for something from the city of Coeur d'Alene, is there something that we can do to improve the mass of the building? Because they know it's a big building and are trying to mitigate it. You can see in the first mitigation, they put very large trees in here, and we're currently looking for very large trees to be able to transplant, because they want to not wait a long time for the trees to grow up. So the idea to further mitigate the mass of it was by adding windows on this particular northeast elevation. You can see we added them in here, so it breaks up that blank wall that Commissioner Ingalls was referring to. On this corner, if you notice right here, it's just the same siding, but here we're talking about going in and wrapping those windows around the corner. So again, trying to add some entrance to that facade. And then John Barlow came up with this idea. You've probably seen this on the press building, where they have some really nice ivy that goes up there. It requires building a masonry wall in here, because you can't put ivy on steel-sided buildings, because it will actually go inside. And so we have to build a masonry wall there to put that ivy on there. But that was another one of the facade improvements that they're proposing. Another view, looking at the northeast side, again, windows here, and on the other side, we've wrapped the windows along that corner. And so you can see how that, so the objective is, it's a big building. And when you think about the ways you may mitigate the impact of that, adding landscape in front of it, Hillary and John and I had lots of different brainstorming ideas of how do you mitigate the impact of that building. And at the end of the day, John Barlow had made the comment, we really just need to make the building look better. And so that is their proposal. So the request is a reduced shoreline setback based on the following findings, that, you know, it can be a flexible shoreline to some extent. The shoreline was originally further west. The adjoining waterway is private. And probably fourth, they're willing to make improvements to the building in exchange for the reduced setback. So that is my presentation, Chairman Messina.
Okay. Questions for, nope, good enough? No question? Yep, oh, go ahead, John.
Well, my sense is that the justification has been met in this case, and the modification, in my mind, visually, as you drive into Coeur d'Alene from south of town or whatnot, what's approved versus what would be changed, it would be minor in perception, you know. So I think the justification's been met. I think the modification is consistent with the limited design PUD that we've already approved. And I believe that the mitigation, you know, more than makes up for, you know, any perceptible change that you would see visually, so.
That's your
Sound-
recommendation?
Well, I think we don't make findings per se. I think it's just a motion, and I would make a motion that we approve this modification as being consistent with the limited design PUD.
Okay. Got a motion.
I'll second that motion.
Do we need to do a roll call, or just simple, all in favor?
It'd probably be good to do roll call, just to verify
Okay.
it.
Fleming,
Yes.
Ingalls,
Yes.
Lutrip, Mandel,
Yes.
Rumpler.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. Item I-1-19 is approved. See you in a little bit, Phil.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, the Next, it's more of a presentation on the Atlas Waterfront Development Standards, and I guess Phil Boyd? Well, nice to see you again. Haven't seen you in a while.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I think that was unintentional, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, thanks. It's good to be here back again. We have been working on the upland development. A little update on the park part of the project. You guys may have read in the newspaper that project was out to bid. We received, it's a long story, but we have a contractor. And so we'll be initiating work shortly. I'm here with Don Veggie from GGLO, who is our urban designer, and you'll hear from both Don and I. We actually may stand up here. Don, you're welcome to come up, and we might tag team a lot of this. The objective today on this part of our presentation is to review how the development standards have changed. The commission was involved early on, where we were presenting ideas to you, you were providing us feedback, and we have been working on those things. At the last meeting, the commission had wondered what the development community thought about our development standards, which spurred us into another effort where we went out and did a developer survey and outreach meetings, and I'll talk a little bit about those. So we're bringing all that information back to you today in this format to give you an opportunity to have more dialogue with us and dig into it. So again, Chairman Messina, if it's appropriate, we'll take questions as we go if that's how you'd like to run it. We're going to talk about the site design changes, the developer outreach, review the development standards, and we'll talk about the parking analysis, because that was another popular topic. So this was the last image you all saw of the site, and there's been changes to that, and they're in these areas. Up here in this corner, the road alignments were changed due to earthwork, and I can tell you more detail if you want, but I'm going to gloss over it. In this area, we were able to, we believe, add development areas in a cost-effective way, because as you might recall, this area has unsuitable soils associated with it. And then down in this area, this probably came out of Hillary's group, where really promoting this idea of figuring out how to create a little more commercial intensity in that area. This is what the rendering currently looks like. So you can see the road alignment has changed here. So you slope down off of Southeast Way. You can see we've added quite a bit of single family up in here, or townhomes. Don will talk a little bit about that later. That was in response to our developer survey. And you can see we have a little different configuration down here for larger commercial opportunities. You guys have seen this before, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the pedestrian bicycle network got a little bit better. We have a little bit better connectivity up in this area. We've got a nice green space up here. We call it Atlas Bluff, because we're going to end up taking and moving some of the unsuitable soils into this area. So there's a very robust pedestrian and bicycle network. In addition, the view sheds were super important, and again, we've talked about this before, but we're just trying to illustrate the opportunities where you have the corridors, which are pretty substantial, and how far you can be up on the hill and see all the way down to the river. Right when you pull off of here, you're looking right down into the river. And then the idea of, as you drive along this waterfront drive, you're looking into the park and that entire view shed through there. So the developer outreach, we did 3 major things, and they're still ongoing. One was a developer workshop, which you guys can imagine, getting a bunch of developers in the room and presenting to them. None of them really want to say much, because they didn't want to tip their hand. But we wanted to give them the opportunity, and we want them to see Heartland and give them the opportunity to be exposed to them. So we did a developer workshop right in this room. Heartland has been doing direct contact. If somebody contacts Hillary or me, we send them on to Heartland, so we all kind of have an arm's length connection with them. And then a developer survey that was put out to look at project interest, product interest, and what do you think of our development standards. And that was really the objective here of that survey is, are what we're proposing consistent with what you all developers would build? Do you see issues with what we're proposing? Do you have comments about our development standards and parking and products and those types of things? So here's just a quick snapshot of the results, and I'm speeding through these things because I want to get to the meat of the presentation here with Don. The short story is developers kind of said, gosh, you a little more townhomes than we're interested in, because here's what we're showing and here's what their interest is. And the survey was structured in a way for them to be able to answer that in a numerical way. Single family, probably no big surprise. We need more single family. There's some impacts to that on the overall neighborhood character. And just to take a little bit of a step back on the broader overview and refresh everybody's memory, remember Ignite and the city will be partners in evaluating developer proposals. And so, and Hillary's will be part of that, Heartland will be part of that. So they will be able to evaluate these proposals that come in. And so if it's all single family, well, that's probably not consistent with our vision of that area. And so we'll be able to shape what actually gets built in that area. There's also the economic component, because Tony will be there making sure that we're generating revenue to reimburse the city and do things. But this is what the developers were responding back to us that they thought was their desire to put in that area. The other interesting thing, and probably not terribly surprising, is where are they interested in buying? And of course, the waterfront areas they're interested in, these back ones, maybe not so much. Here's kind of a summary of the results. There's a demand out there. They thought our standards were pretty good. In a couple of discussions we've had with developers, they like the certainty that appears to be being set up. Because remember, for developers, one of the big things is certainty. I want to know what I have to do, how long it's going to take me to do it, and what is my range of motion within the white lines on the road. And so they like that idea of it, thought maybe a little bit you're missing some things on senior housing, other elements that you see in there. And then the idea of, are you going to come in and buy one block or multiple blocks? There were lots of them that said, you know, I want to offer on multiple blocks, and if I do really great, do I get an advantage on the next time an RFP comes out? And so those are things we're working through with Heartland. But the point of that we got back, the feedback is people are pretty bullish on this project. General feedback that we had, I mean, you guys will have this in your packet. If you don't, I guess you might not already. But some comments that we heard from them, you know, should we split up the blocks more? You know, do you think we're going to be able to attract commercial tenants in that area? Is the project pricing correct? And we just had some general comments back from them. So I want to just jump a little bit into the parking, and we might toggle back and forth on this as we move through the presentation, but the parking has been a big question. We surveyed them intentionally to see what was their thought on the parking demand, and so they gave us a max and a min on what they needed for the different product types, and then I've superimposed over here the city standard. One of the interesting things here is, you know, the minimums get pretty small in here. The medians, though, are pretty consistent and maybe a little bit on the above the city standards. The commercial areas you can see down in here that are above, and certainly in this instance for office and retail. And that was one of the things, and I think the commission's heard it before, the multifamily folks will come in and say, it's interesting that you guys want to have parking spaces for a one bedroom, but we won't build anything unless it has two parking spaces, because we know we're going to have a parking problem. Same thing what we heard from some of the office space developers is that they like to see more parking than what your code requires. These are just excerpts out of your code. One of the things we're going to be talking about a week from today is one of the parking deviations we're requesting, which is reducing the parking requirement for restaurant. And we'll show you why in a little bit. So in response to this question about parking, it's very difficult to come in here and say to the commission or anybody, here's what we're going to do for on-street parking, because here's what our land uses are going to be. We don't know what our land uses are going to be. And the land use potentially drives the on-street parking requirement because of this very situation, where what you probably should put in is 5 per thousand for retail, but you're only required to put in 3 per thousand. So if I'm a developer that says, I'm gonna do 3 per thousand, we all probably know that that's gonna create a parking issue, because the office demand is going to generate 4 or 5 per thousand parking requirements that are in there. So the way we're approaching this is essentially presenting to the commission and the city a framework that says, here's how we're gonna analyze parking. As products develop in these different areas, and we look at the area, the parking required by the code, the likely parking demand, where do we have a deficiency, and how long does it take, if we do have a deficiency, if a person is up in area 10 here, and they need to use an off-street parking spot, are they walking 1,000 feet for it? Or kind of the standard is people will walk 300 or 600 feet to a parking spot? So this gets into quite a bit of detail, and I don't want to belabor it too much, but I think the point we're trying to communicate to both the commission and Ignite is that on-street parking is dynamic, and it's driven off of land use. We don't want to overpark the on-street, because I can tell you a really easy answer to overparking on-street is to come in here and say, well, gee, you don't have parking all along this waterfront drive, just add parking, which we could do, but now you've diminished the character of that street. And we don't want to unnecessarily do that. When we get into developing this parcel, if there's some really great job-creating entity that's coming in there and says, gosh, we only want to build 3 per thousand for our, and we're probably going to have a bigger impact than that. Well, maybe we think about adding a little bit of on-street parking here in a sensitive way, where we're not, just running parking all through there. We'd have landscaping and things like that. So I hope that makes sense on our approach on the parking analysis.
Bill, I've got a question with the presentation, and I'm sure with the rest of it. What's the flexibility of all that happening and just happening? I mean, it's great that you show us the presentation, and I've always been outspoken on this, as far as this plan changing, and we don't see it after we say, okay, this is great, and it's very informative what you're telling us, and but where's the flexibility when it comes to reality of what is all that going to be from city staff, and then it's just, okay, this is what we end up with?
I actually was thinking about you when I was putting the parking framework, because you said that to me enough times, is how does the commission, we'll say, tie the hands of the developer, in this case, the city at Ignite, to honestly follow through and do what we're presenting you here. So we don't have, in this instance, create a parking issue. Well, I think where we're headed with this idea is we would be looking towards the commission to approve the concept of a framework. And we could flush this out more and literally put, an equation to this. And if this land use happens and you generate this deficit in on-site parking, so if you have a deficit on on-site parking, it's going to get pushed to the street, right? So how do you accommodate for that in the street? And are you accommodating it 1 for 1, which doesn't give you any buffer in there, or are you going to have a little bit of buffer in there? And so our proposal would probably to do a parking framework that we could literally quantify and make it part of the PUD. And that's the way you would tie the hands of the developer. My initial reaction would be to say, I don't want you to tie our hands, just leave us to our own business. And I think Ignite would want to say that, and maybe even Hillary and the city would want us to say that. But that might not be satisfactory to the commission. So my first request would be, just let us do our own business. It's the city and Ignite creating a neighborhood in their city, and it's unlikely they're going to do something that would be contrary to the community values, parking being one of them. If that wasn't satisfactory for the commission, well, we'll develop a more robust proposal and submit it and say, here's the way we'd want to do parking based on land use. That's a long-winded explanation. But
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Nope, Commissioner Ingles, did you have?
Well, just, I was just sitting here wondering if could you go back to the other slide real quick? And if this is a one-size-fits-all deal, whether it's on-site parking or street parking, either way, is it the whole thing one standard, or do you vary by block? And my case would be, or my argument might be, to consider it differently block by block, where you have the two, they look like commercial pink structures down in here. Let's say that those are restaurant, that wants to be a restaurant or something like that. And let me just throw at you, I'll call it the tale of two sushi restaurants, okay? You have Momo Sushi right over here, and then you have Syringa up 4th Street. Well, let's say they have the same standard. They probably do, 3 spots per 1,000 feet or of retail or whatever. But, you have much more propensity for poachers, at Momo, because of the water draw. See, whether that's the office or the retail or whatever, you're drawing all those people in there, and unless that restaurant wants to stand guard out there, like you almost have to. See, they almost have to manage that. Where up 4th Street, you or I could park there all day long and get away with it. Could we get away with it at Momo? So that makes my point that it's kind of a different size for a different block?
Absolutely, and that's part of, back to what Chairman Messina had made the comment, is how do you control this? My initial reaction, just because of the illustration you would provide, is the potential land uses and businesses that are going to go into those spaces may be so unique that we would like to have all kinds of flexibility to negotiate with the buyer, figure out where, are we going to have a shared use parking agreement in that particular parking lot? What is their peak hour? Because if you think about, the peak hour of an office is different than the peak hours of a sushi restaurant. And so are we going to have peaks that are offset? And those are things that all go into our brain, but when we're working on parking, it's really difficult, though, to quantify that in something that the commission can say, here, I'll put my stamp on this, because now the document becomes this thick. I would rather you just say, trust us and let us make sure we're going to achieve parking. But I also realize you guys have a job to do, and you might want more white lines on the road than that. And that's why we're just trying to introduce this concept to get the commission's feedback here and hear, what do you think? And yeah, so I'm with you, Commissioner Ingles.
Is that framework something that can be shared with us? I'm not sure how I feel about it at this moment, but it feels like it would be useful to have something that doesn't keep kicking the parking issue down the road for the next buyer and the next buyer. So whether it's that framework or some other tool, just as a way for us to have some assurances that we're not just postponing the bigger issue of parking.
Sure, and I think what we would propose is we would put a narrative together that outlines it, and then some numerical representations of what we're talking about. That's what we attempted to do here. In this particular analysis, we literally went through and kind of took the worst case scenario in every development area and looked at what the parking requirement was based on industry standards, not city code. Because if you use city code, you're under parking in. Not in all instances, but in some instances. And so what we did is we went in and, for instance, medical office wants 4 per 1,000 typically in order to be responsive to their customer base. City code doesn't require it. It's 3 per 1,000. We put in 4 per 1,000 here, demonstrated that there was a deficit, and then here's how you're going to solve the deficit by telling somebody, if you're going to do in area 12 medical office, you're going to have a deficit of 12, so you're going to have to walk 190 feet to on-street parking spaces.
That's the maximum.
Maximum, yeah.
That would be the maximum, the farthest distance you would have to walk from that block to get to.
Hillary, you had?
So I guess to answer Commissioner Mandel's question, so we can certainly provide any of this information with the commission, and especially if they're going to dial in a little bit more on the framework. But I think it's important to note, you're really only asking for a reduction from the code only for restaurant. Some of our projects that we've had, and including like downtown is very different standards than Midtown. Yes. So I think it's important to note, if we just followed the code, there might be extra people parking down there, but we're not creating a parking issue that we've had in other PUD projects that have asked for less parking. So I think they're just trying to help guide us so that we don't end up with a parking challenge, but truly you're only asking for reduction for the restaurants, which there can be off hours, we can get shared parking agreements and reductions through the code without any deviations.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not necessarily a code requirement that we provide this. We could literally just say, we're not required to have this dialogue with you. We're going to meet the code requirements. We're asking for one deviation. That's not being responsive to one of our clients. You're part of our client base as being the planning commission, just like Parks and Rec is part of the client base. So we're trying to be responsive to the question you guys put before us at the last meeting and articulate to you how we plan on dealing with parking as we move forward in the development.
Okay. I have a more global concern. I think we're in the weeds when it comes to parking, frankly,
Yeah.
way in the weeds. I am more concerned, we're getting a pushback in this city to historically fence in a bunch of areas, which then tells us we cannot put multifamily, we cannot put towers. They're trying to shut us out of those areas. This is the last remaining water aspect, looking across to a beautiful green space. I'm very concerned when the pushback from the developers is, let's put in another Coeur d'Alene Place. Let's put a bunch of single-family homes that has very little payback for land use, which is at such a premium here. And now we have to plow multiple streets, and we have single roofs, single walls, very underutilized premier land, when the pushback is, let's do Coeur d'Alene Place all over again. And one thing that I'm seeing, and I think that the developers need to see this is, and I think this way, I want to see sectional elevations going up a hill. Because I think all you're going to do is you're going to sit on the top of a hill in your house, all you're going to see is single-family roofs all the way down the slope, instead of having vistas and open spaces that are driven by multifamily vertical towers. You get aspects that are interesting instead of a slather of single-family homes. So I'm not worried about parking at this point. I'm worried that we're going to slam in a lazy man solution where we need more people, we need affordable housing, we need more people to live and walk and park and forget about the car and not address the cars as the foremost object. What we need to do is maximize this land use. And I'm concerned that we get dragged in the way of the developers and not go, well, you know what, I think we can hold on a little longer and get the right solution here. And I've seen a lot of it in this planning, but then I see these numbers that are frightening. That feedback is like, wow, that's just lazy. We got lots of flat land out there and it's moving toward Post Falls. Let it all go out there. But this is not the place for a bunch of single roofs, single houses. It doesn't make sense.
And I'll give you one comment back, and then Don might have other stuff to weigh in on that. The way we intend to manage that is through the RFP process. And that's why the diversity of the group that will evaluate those isn't just, people that are interested in the initial capital return. They're interested in other things, particularly Hillary and her group will look at these things and be a voice in the selection process. It still has to be economical. It still has to hit a bunch of other buttons. But the RFP process won't be just what was the bottom dollar that the developer offered to the city. It's what did the developer offer to buy the dirt at, what's the product they're going to put in there, what does the product look like. There's a whole bunch of criteria in the RFP process to give the opportunity to respond to just what you're talking about, Commissioner Fleming. It doesn't mean that it will land where you're saying.
But at least we can get closer.
Exactly.
I'm worried if we turn over and roll over on
Yeah.
our bellies to get the developers on board.
Yeah, no,
And those numbers are frightening that they threw back at us.
Yeah.
Frightening. I mean, I understand the retail. I'd be scared of retail every day of the week now. But I'm very concerned when we just want single-family homes. That's what the easy deal home run is.
Yeah.
And, go down to Riverstone, look what we ended up with. Hello. So, yeah, big
Well,
fail.
We'll let you continue here, and we'll
Just,
Sorry.
hit you
we
up
can,
with more questions
which one is
later.
it? Sorry.
it's that. It's
This one?
This one.
Or does this one
No,
work?
this one, just that one.
This one.
Yeah, you'll.
Just one, so there's the numbers, and clearly that's one message. I think perhaps some of the reaction here might be from the graphic as well and what we're representing there. And what some of this is about the story that we're telling. As you know, from what we've been through this, the blocks standards we've tried to build in as much of a reasonable range of what can be achieved on many of these. So what we're seeing in that where is it?
It's this
The illustrative site plan, and it is just that, an illustrative site plan, say it again. This is not, as you know, said it before, not necessarily the pattern. If we need to change what's represented in this graphic, we can do that. Some of this, the thinking in updating this, it's responding to some of these street changes and to the realization of this parking thing, though, because these things are working hand in hand. In some places that we were showing some slightly higher density product as just this picture, but it does, again, help tell that story we've taken out because of the reality of this parking challenge. To be really clear, we were showing more potential multifamily in some of these blocks up here, but when that was assuming that 1.5 stalls per unit previously, and we get into all this, it's possible, but not super likely, given the dimensions of these blocks when we have to have additional parking. So it's all complicated, and we maybe need to circle back and figure out, as Phil was talking about, dialing in the parking, dialing in the story to tell the right thing.
Okay, we'll get moving along. This is just an illustration to talk about how much on-street parking is here. Just to count, we're showing it here. There's a waterfront parking lot down in here. One of the comments I've received about the waterfront parking lot is it big enough? I don't think it's big enough. I mean, literally people I've run into in places, that parking lot doesn't make big enough, based on what? It's really difficult to find a standard for how big does a public open space parking lot need to be. We originally started out in the 70 range. This one's at 130 because we heard so much from the city council that it needs to be larger. This is similar in size on a per acre basis as City Park. So City Park has about 180 parking spaces in it. That's both at the museum lot and Independence. This is 130. So on a per acre basis, it's similar. It's about 11 spaces per acre, just as a reference point. Let's see, I'll turn it over to Don at this point. Yeah.
So I'm going to run through a few of the high points of some of the changes that we've made, and a lot of them in response to the feedback from you, some of it in response to developer feedback, some of it in response to what we've learned about the site, and Phil talking about the soils issues and the grading that might be possible in the Atlas Bluff area. So we hit parking pretty good. We might come back to it again in this discussion before we're done. One of the things that you all asked us to think about was building separation and some of those dimensions of lots if there are single-family or duplex or townhouse lots, and how the buildings at that, the fee simple type of development might relate to each other. We have increased the minimum building separation from 10 feet to 12 feet. So on a side situation in a townhouse duplex, side-by-side duplex or single-family, it would be 6 feet minimum to that property line. Along with that, while I'm on this issue, just talk about a few other dimensions, since I don't know how much you've gone through the most recent standards, but in dialing in just overall lot sizes with developers for townhouses, they recommended a range from 20 feet to up to, get my numbers here, 20 feet to 36 maximum width that would apply to a duplex situation perhaps as well. Single family, 32-foot minimum for a small lot single family in its width, and up to 75 feet wide with 80-foot minimum lot depths on both of these. Again, some of this is a function, we've talked about it before, of the north-south dimension of this site and trying to fit everything in between the river, the Riverfront Parkway, and Celtice. So being more flexible on width and a little less flexible on depth, just to make things work. That results in minimum lot sizes for townhouses at 1,600 square feet, 2,500 for single family. It's just a minimum. And it's simply the math and the way that works out. We've talked about, you asked us to think about the gradation of building heights, sort of side to side, and especially stepping back from the river. Commissioner Fleming, you were just talking about that quite a bit, and the potential for water views. We have You may have noticed that we are proposing on many of the blocks for, again, that fee simple type of product to have a height limit of up to 40 feet. And that's to, again, allow the slightly higher density of development. So we might have skinnier, either single-family homes or townhouses, which might require a third story and then an appropriate roof character, whether it's a peak or a gable or something like that. So that's what that flexibility is allowing. I wanted to just jump. So I'm going to now scroll back and forth between a couple of different exhibits. So just on the issue of how these things step up from the waterfront. I'm going to we have two site sections here, and this one is representing the change, the proposed change in Area 9 and Area 4 with this new street here. This is called Street 10 still. And what that, when we start to think about that, so what before, previously in this, the thought was we weren't necessarily going to regrade this. There's a steep slope, as you know, on the edge of the Atlas Bluff area, and we have significant grade change down to the lower part of Area 4 with this alley and the potential for different things that could happen, different densities that could happen here. Here's what I was talking about, Commissioner Fleming, with those previous showing some more multifamily down in the lower. But if we can move some of that dirt, regrade here, as Phil was saying, it gives us potential to create a street that comes up and connects around like this. Still has great connections for pedestrians down the hillside, opens up this block a little bit more, can possibly modify the alley a bit, and some of the same different uses and building types can happen down here, but it has just a little bit different configuration and how it works with the grading and more flexibility. So if we imagine this, how this scenario plays out, and these could easily be duplexes, or these could easily be townhouses at a higher density, also could still be just physically could fit the multifamily with parking below if the market will bear. But we've drawn this scenario, which is more of the fee simple type product types from the waterfront street up to Celtice. And so you start to see what's happening, a little bit of grade change up to the alley. The big challenge was always going to be how we deal with that grade change between the top of the bluff and the lower area. Here, by doing this, allows us to create a series of terraces, and basically at this particular location, we're probably going to have to deal with somewhere of 18 to 20-ish grade change between these two areas. So you start to see, that happening here. And then it softens as we go from here up to the top of the site. And if I just scroll through this a little bit more, so you see that starting to happen here. There's the potential. This is a speculation on how this might play out. This could be a townhouse. This could be a duplex. This could be single family. And these lots on this block are a little bit deeper, so they might be able to have a garage back here. But if on a narrower condition, it might be part of the base of this building. This could be an attic. This could be the third story or a partial third story with the roof above. It's kind of generic, just to help us all envision how this plays out with the flexibility. So here's the challenging block, or where something a little bit creative needs to be done. So, and again, there's a certain amount of lot depth here. So this speculation is perhaps there's a detached garage. Because you need to have a fair amount of grade change happening across there, the back of the building might act as a retaining wall, stairs in between. Perhaps there's a cottage or a workshop or something above. Minimum amount of grade change in the yard, but that there's some flexibility there. And then potentially a daylight basement or a basement that's fully occupied and fully finished. This has flexibility in what kind of unit it is and how tall that could be. So here you see that approximately 20-foot grade change across there, and we can imagine different ways that this could play out. About 10 feet across this lot here. In this case, it has to be front-loaded, so there would be a garage here and perhaps some additional basement area. and the potential for some shared open space or public open space in between these lots, as we've shown in the illustrative site plan. And it gets a little bit more flat as we approach the top of the hill, that street that's connecting back to the main north-south street connecting to the waterfront and to Celtice. And I'm just going to, while I'm here talking about this, one of the things, and I'll come back to it, is it was on the list, is in somewhat from your comments, but also what we've heard from developers and what we've witnessed might be possible as we made some of these changes, that some of these areas might have a wider range of uses and building types than we had previously thought about. For example, you remember, we've talked about mixed use down here and how that might work. What's interesting is mixed use up here, at least in this scenario, with this combination of uses where you might have retail. This is about 19,000 square feet of retail in this sort of sketchy scenario here, and perhaps a little building marking the corner. About 80 cars there. That parks, assuming some of them in the restaurant, as Hillary was talking about with the potential reduction for some of that. Assume 3 stories of housing above. I didn't quite get yet to drawing that, but we could. You're all used to looking at lots of architectural drawings. You start to see that if this became wider and it was a 4-story building with perhaps a level of parking below, working with the hillside, then we're getting a nice terracing of taller buildings up on top, which they can then overlook. Kind of accentuates the hillside. It's an interesting idea that if it plays out economically and someone is interested in doing it, might really help achieve the goals, especially on a block like this. So the steeper sloped blocks, areas are going to have the opportunities for these kind of relationships. And so, of course, this is probably the most dramatic. Also, relatively dramatic here from Area 7 down to Area 5 to the waterfront. But while we're on this just issue of heights and what you were bringing up previously, Commissioner Fleming, if we go to the western part of the site, it's much flatter. And you may recall that when we had this is like going a year and a half ago when we were first looking at concepts, we looked at block structures where here, it's both flat and then a little bit steep as you get up towards Celtice. And we had looked at potentially 1, 2, 3 blocks where the buildings were all kind of oriented more this way, siding and facing north-south streets, so that theoretically here's your house, you have a corner window or something. You always have at least some kind of angular view down to the water. It just became evident that wasn't really going to work well from a grading point of view up here. And as Phil and his team have looked at it more closely, it's only confirmed that, and that's why this kink in this road is happening. So. It's a long way around to saying the areas below are a bit, you can see it's quite a bit less steep. And so that's why the street here and the next street over become very important for maintaining those waterfront views kind of mid part of this block. But it's just we have some trade-offs in how we imagine these blocks developing, because I think there's a good chance that they're going to have filtered views, through and in between these buildings. But we can talk about that more during some Q&A if you'd like. Let's see, let me go back up to my list. Revised, I started to touch on revised land uses. So these are just highlighting the areas. Phil already talked about them, about where the changes were happening in the plan. And we have in Area 9, we were always thinking about that it might have a range of possible use types from single-family to townhouse to office to multifamily, but we never had contemplated mixed use. Again, that was more thinking about it more as that plateau. Perhaps we should have, but it became more evident as we're thinking about it, and would like to get your feedback on whether you think that's an appropriate thing to add into the standards. In Area 11, In the illustrative site plan, you saw single family, but we also, if you have seen the potential configuration scenarios, we're also speculating multifamily flats or retail. Neglected to think about office there. Perhaps we thought about office on Area 9, but as we understand what might be possible here and possibly in Area 10, wondering what you think about basically kind of creating the same general series of possible uses and building types, especially between these two, and should some of those migrate as possibilities over to Area 10. We could talk about retail in Area 10. Previously, we never contemplated office or mixed use here because the block was a little bit small, but with the change here, we have additional land area. Thinking about office and some of the parking that needs to go with it might be hidden behind, might be an appropriate neighbor with the residential across the street, something to think about. And finally, I just wanted to say a few things about precedence and density. Of course, we talked about density the last time I was here, gave a density presentation. And some of your comments back to us after that were about calibrating, understanding that some amount of density is appropriate here, so we can balance the financials and the land use and things like that. And Commissioner Fleming was just talking about some of that quite eloquently. But we've added some visuals into the document for the different precedents that we've been looking at along the way that are different from the types that I might have been showing you in the density presentation, not necessarily Seattle or Portland or the suburbs of those cities, but more inland Northwest and Rocky Mountain region types that are great examples that we've been thinking about as we've been doing these standards and thinking about the design all along. And we have adjusted some of our images. You have provided a few to us, the commission has, and included those into the document in our representation of the building types and frontages. And one thing I meant to say earlier but forgot to say was that still it is the block standards that are the most important. We have, in dialing in this the document, we have simplified the introduction a bit. We've simplified the frontages as much as possible, and the images, diagrams, and principles for the building types. I think I'm going to pause there and see what you might have questions about and might want to discuss
I'm
further.
sure there'll be a few questions, perhaps, but a couple of comments on my view corridors to us. We hear that a lot. It's tough, especially on that site. You know, if you're up on Celtice trying to see the river, it's going to be it's just going to be tough. And I have to admit, I don't think I've ever stopped on Celtice to actually look down. Right now, sure, I can see the river because there's nothing there, but when you have all this going on, that's a challenge. And whether or not we're going to get view corridors, the view that I see right in front of me here, seeing the park and everything, that's a view corridor. You put a couple of buildings there, you're not going to see that. And that's a challenge.
Yep.
So I'm not saying, that the view corridors is the most important thing. It is important to a certain extent, but to be realistic about it, to get it from Celtice all the way down the river, that's going to be a challenge. My biggest thing, again, is the PUD and any modifications that come to it. As we had on our first presentation, there was a PUD that was approved that came to us because of the reasoning of the shoreline. Will this come back to us, and where does staff see that modification of a PUD kick back to the Planning Commission, given this whole proposal, what Phil presented to us, and given flexibilities for developers to change this or that and the guidelines? Where does that, or where do you perhaps anticipate that kicking in and saying, well, this is a modification, we better bring it back to this commission?
Did you want for me to answer that? And then I can
Well,
bring
yeah, and I
John
know
in
this is a
after.
long process going on, but again, I think everyone here gets to feel where I'm coming from, where the rest of the commissioners are coming from. I think we all have our little items that we want to make sure that this is developed correctly and not something that we're going to be sorry we did. So again, yeah, if you want to try to answer that, Hillary, you can. Go ahead.
Sure, and I think if you've read through this detailed document, I think the design team has done a ton of work to come up with various options for each of the blocks. So the goal is to not have a bunch of amendments come before the Planning Commission. I think, we've done a thoughtful research through this whole process, getting input from the Planning Commission, from the public, from the development community, that hopefully most things are going to be able to work, that the development community comes forward and says, yeah, I'm going to build in block 10. That might be one that we want to get some input from the commission to say, okay, should we also allow maybe office in that block? But I think overall, we aren't wanting to have a lot of amendments come forward. If there's something significant, then it would need to come before the Planning Commission, absolutely, to make changes. But I think having Ignite and the city work closely together to review any of the RFPs that come forward, the goal is we want it to be consistent with what gets approved so that we're not seeing amendment after amendment. But obviously, conditions might change, market conditions might change, so can't say there won't be any amendments in the future, but I think this is very well thought out, that there are lots of options for each block, that we should be in good hands.
All right, yeah, because we have the public input on this, and we don't want to end up with something and the general public goes, well, the city did what they wanted to do. I just don't want that to happen, because Ignite's involved, and the city owns this unique piece of property and the ownership in it all. So that's my 2 cents, and I'll let it go for the rest of them. John, go ahead.
I'll throw my 2 cents in there, and I think, as Phil mentioned, I think we have to, be it parking or be it the standards of, what's in what block or whatever. I think we got to trust the process and bet on a certain amount of it's gonna turn out all right. It will. And trust the process. It's going to be great. It's not going to develop in the end exactly like that. It will change. But we have a kind of a roadmap to come back to, just like in the previous presentation. The interpretation. Here's what we approved, and well, as we come back to it, we'll have something to look back on. But I think, and I appreciate Commissioner Fleming's comments, but you look at Riverstone, we can be really critical there. And, SRM, when they developed that, it's different than they thought it would be. And it morphed and it changed. And we went through the Great Recession during that evolution. And yeah, it's not what they had pictures like that.
Sure.
I could find one in City Hall that kind of looked like that. They had all kinds of. They had a whole parcel called freeway retail, if you remember that. That all went away, because the economics changed, and they will maybe in this one. And hey, they're going to be a little bit different. So, as I sit here, here's what matters to me, and I think is. The city wouldn't even be in this business. The city isn't SRM developers. This is odd for the city to kind of be quarterbacking a development project. It's kind of a weird duck, I think. That's what developers do. We're kind of doing we're playing Riverstone here in a sense. What matters here, the reason the city's here is that they stepped up really to protect the waterfront. So what really matters at the end of the day, whether it's a townhouse or a mixed use, 4-story, 3-story, so be it. What matters to me at this seat here, it's all about the waterfront. And looking at this thing, I'm pretty darn comfortable. And the rest of it is really there to afford to buy that waterfront and develop that waterfront. The rest of it's paying the fee, is it not, to do what really matters here. And as I look at that, about 100% of the waterfront is public and going to be really cool. It's going to have a ton of amenities. And as we have been critical up here, looking at Riverstone, about like Bella Reeve, and maybe that didn't turn out so great. And even though technically that's public along there and there's kind of a boardwalk, how inviting is it? How inviting really is that for me? When I go down there, I feel a little bit of pushback. When I look at this right here with that big, generous green park right there, and all of that parking, we're harping on parking. I see something that looks a lot like what we have right behind us here, that I feel inviting, and I feel that the waterfront's been preserved, and that's what this whole deal, in my mind, was all about from the get-go. Why'd the city get involved in this deal? And the rest of that, we want it to be cool and all that, and it will. But I think the waterfront's going to be great.
I was Chairman Messina, I might just jump in.
Go right ahead.
I appreciate Commissioner Ingalls' comments, and your comment is, that's been driving a lot of what you actually see here. And back to an illustration about that, what you see in the development standards ultimately will be what gets approved. That is available for a builder to come in and do. And so, as was mentioned earlier, when we get to Area 11, right now, Area 11 here is not eligible under this current set of development standards to have office in it. So if a developer came in 9 months from now and said, gosh, I really want to put office in there, we'd be back meeting with Hillary saying, gosh, we never told the commission we were going to put office in there. It wasn't one of the proposed in the development standards. We probably need to go back to the commission. We think it's a suitable use. We've kind of thought about it recently, and that's why we're bringing it up. But I think that's an illustration where we'd be coming back to the commission and say, hey, we didn't have office up here. Here's the reasons we think it's compelling. We want to amend the PUD and amend our development standards to include that. But all the other uses that you see in the PUD, which might be townhomes, single-family, multifamily up in Area 11, we won't be back here asking for it because Tony will be pushing the RFP selection committee to say, make a decision, because we got to turn this into both capital immediately and tax increment. And that's the flavor, and it is driven by what you have told us, that you want some level of certainty for the commission to look at. And it's also driven by what Ignite is trying to accomplish on behalf of for the city, is quickly transact this and get it moving. And that's what we're trying to achieve with those development standards.
I appreciate it. That's what I wanted to hear, actually. Go ahead, Leanne.
I was just going to say I appreciate the effort. I think it gives us a good working framework. I think anything too much more is so prescriptive that we don't have a lot of agility to work with it and make it pencil out. And I think understanding the RFP process a little bit better, how those get evaluated and what principles are reflected. But I think a lot is contained in here that reflects our principles and waterfront access and some of the blind spots we might have related to parking and river views. So I think there's a lot that is set up for us to use as reference, and I hope that just kind of fidelity to process lets this play out quickly and effectively.
And taking that just a little step further, Commissioner Randall, the RFP process, literally one of the ranking criteria is how true to the development standards is your proposal. And so that's literally, it's going to get some numbers associated with that. If I come in with little pink houses, that's not true to this vision that Don's developed here. And it would get a lower ranking regardless of what the residual land value you're going to propose to buy it from Ignite at. So we've tried to numerically, as best we can, accommodate for what Chairman Messina has talked about. Your words have not been lost on us.
It hasn't, and I'll keep repeating it.
Yeah,
It's fine. It's
yeah.
great. No, I'm very pleased with this. I agree with what John said. The waterfront is the biggest criteria on this and stuff, so.
Can I lay in one more thing? I worked in hotels for 30 years, so I see there's a lack. I think that we should have a hospitality factor in here up against Celtice. We're seeing the demand, and yes, hotels are shifting. I mean, even Marriott is now in Airbnbs, but I think that we need to have some flexibility in 10, 9, or 11. One or the other of those needs to address hospitality on an easy access route in and out. It's not disturbing to the adjacencies, and it's a buffer for that traffic. So I think we need to build in the hospitality, dangle it, and maybe someone will come to the party. But we're seeing a lot of those mid-brands, the smaller brands that are starting to break out, and they're coming to the city. So I think we need to, this would be a balance to draw away from what's hitting down further and way out in Hayden. There's not much in between except Apple Way, and that's definitely the lower end, so, yeah.
Well, that's the type of feedback we were hoping to, not just that feedback, all the feedback we've received today, but that particular feedback about land use is, is there something we're not,
I'm looking for missing. I don't want to bless everything. I think this is great.
Yeah.
But you got to look for the missing parts, and
That-
I'm
that's what
seeing
we're
some
asking
missing
for.
things.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah.
I mean, it's great to pat everybody on the back, but reality is,
Yeah.
look what we're missing.
So the-
And we're missing those things.
in both 9, 10, and 11, look
Yeah,
at hospitality?
I would give them the flexibility to determine where they're best suited. Maybe it's not the best place to dump hotels out on the circle, but maybe it's great down at 11 and the top of 9. That's a
What's
good
your
buffer.
reaction to something on 13?
Yeah, that would be super desirable, and wouldn't we love a waterfront hotel? I mean, a beautiful little Falls Creek boutique hotel here. I mean, it'd be awesome.
We actually got that comment the other day.
Vancouver Falls Creek Hotel, full every day of every
Yeah.
year down in Vancouver, so that'd be awesome. Yeah, I think we need to let that dangle. So,
Okay.
yeah.
I'll echo those comments as well, that anything up on Celtice, commercial, is probably a better fit up there than anywhere down, close to the river, except for maybe that area 13, a boutique,
Oh, wouldn't that be?
small little something. I think that was a
Yeah.
very good comment.
I could make some
Thank
phone
you.
calls.
So we've
I-
kind of talked about that area of 13, sorry, my angle's down by the water, and the circle as being more of the third place desired, kind of where people actually can access for meals, entertainment, that it really draws from the rest of the city out there, which I think a boutique hotel could still serve that, but other retail office functions or other commercial office functions maybe on those northern lots. But, I think we've done a good job outlining what we don't want to see in this.
Right.
And I'm kind of keen to see what comes that we haven't even thought of that we actually find out we do want when there's some creativity that's allowed to go.
Yep.
Hospitality, other options too.
Lou, you got anything to add down there?
Not a lot to add. I would just again commend Wells Comer and GGLO for, putting together a plan that is attempting to optimize for success. I think we've said before, I've said before, certainly perfect cannot be the enemy of good. And to think about, where this property sits today and the vision of what it will be is a remarkable transformation. As to the hospitality piece, a successful execution of this plan no doubt will stimulate development north of this project. There's plenty of the strip between I-90 and Celtice is really, there's a cattle, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's certainly underutilized. So my suspicion is that, a successful execution of these phases will stimulate additional development along Celtice north of this project. So again, I would just say, well done, and we look forward to seeing how this develops over time.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Hillary.
Mr. Chairman, so I wanted to clarify really with Phil and Don also. So area 10 is the one that I see as missing office and retail, and 11 includes it. So I was wondering if that was one that we wanted the commission to weigh in.
Yeah,
On
that's one I thought
that.
as well.
Area,
It's a buffer.
Does area 11 have office?
It does, and retail
Oh, I did not.
allowed. So
Wow,
it's
you
10
did-
that's missing it.
I was more thinking ahead than I remembered.
that might have been just the most recent addition that we literally did.
Did a lot of
few nights
changes.
ago.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
But it does seem that 10 would be another appropriate location.
Yeah,
Yes.
that will put some 10, yeah.
Offices, high traffic,
That's just more flexibility
Easy
to be
access.
successful,
right?
Yeah.
It'll be a busy hub, so it'll be noisy for,
10 does not.
but if it's a 9 to 5 medical practice or something, it's quiet at night. So, yeah, that'd be good.
To give Phil and Hillary, I guess, some direction, are we okay on 10?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, what about those other two that are,
Well, we already got,
11 has it.
we got 11 already.
right,
So the only other one would be 13.
we'll go with 11 and,
And 13 would be pretty amazing as a hotel. Yeah.
I think, Area 13, which is funny to mention Area 13. but-
51, it's not Area 51.
Yeah, really, I don't know what that might
Oh,
be.
thank
We
God we
might
don't
never
have a
ever get
51.
into that area to look at
Let's
it,
hope
but
not.
I'd say
Yeah.
some sort of flexibility in that,
Okay.
Yep.
as Lynn said, and Did you get all that? Go ahead.
Would you also want to look at area 4 or 5 for that hospitality? Because I think before the
4 and
thought was that
5?
13 would really be more the third place versus
Yeah,
a
it-
Five
hotel.
probably is covered.
And that, I don't think 4 or
5
5
would-
shows it on here, but those ones seem like that was,
I don't
Or
know
we
if I
talked about
pulled- I didn't
multi-story.
pull
Five's
4 or
not there.
5 into this presentation, but you guys have, everyone I think has the document. We had
Commercial.
the idea, it's very consistent with the idea of the mixed-use scale. Could be part of that, it could be separate from that.
Exactly.
In place of that. So that's, I guess we would just simply need to add that use to the list.
A lot of hotels are doing the market on the lower and
Yep.
accommodations above are mixed-use apartments and condo, Airbnb kind of stuff, so I think that's covered in 5. Looks good.
Let's see. I don't know if we have, oh, I think Don mentioned this earlier, though Commissioner Rumpler, I think, had provided some imagery that we've incorporated into the document moving
Thank you.
forward. Yeah,
Thank
it was a good comment, and I think it does, part of it is to provide inspiration, right? And so I think it's providing representative things like that are appropriate to put into the document. So,
Where do we go from here?
well, we're in front of you.
Tuesday night.
Yeah.
It's a do-over.
Yep, next week, it'll be a little more, obviously, I don't know, if formal is the right word.
You're going to wear a suit? Oh, just wondering.
Excuse me.
No, and there'll be there's obviously a little bit more of a formal process involved with that. And that's why, as Hillary and I had talked about this, she thought it was a good idea, and I do too. And having Dawn here, where we can have this type of dialogue is a little easier than when we're in a public hearing, I think.
Yeah, right. Do we have any timeline on that, Hillary, for public hearings and any of that, or is it down the road for a
so
while?
well, the public hearings are next week.
That's next
Next
week.
So our
week, Tuesday.
official meeting, we'll have the public hearing for the planned unit development and the subdivision, so kind of the master
All
plat
right, so
for this.
public is welcome.
Yeah, yeah.
And the findings might come
At the end of that?
Well, the findings will be with those.
at the end of that?
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
Yeah. We just thought it was appropriate to kind of give you
Oh,
guys
it's
this
good.
venue, because if you saw something that was like
Shake
really
it out.
shocking to you, or that was not in the direction that you had previously provided us, we wanted to be able to deal with it, whether, you know, it was postponing, or, but if we seem like we're on the pretty good path, we'll just forge ahead and keep the 12th.
No, it's a good shakedown. I
So
think
this
that's
is
good.
our actual last chance, somewhat.
I think.
Tuesday is.
Yeah, Tuesday's your last chance. on
Right.
it. Yeah, we're trying to move, you know, there's all this other stuff behind the scenes, the RFP process we mentioned earlier, that we're trying to march that along pretty quickly in order to accomplish some of the revenue goals that Ignite and the city have set for ourselves. And so that's why we're trying to move pretty judiciously about this.
No. Well, I'm comfortable.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just you always do a really good job when you come to us, kind of outlining the process, what the activities leading up to the presentation and where we are. Is it possible as part of that presentation, just the whole project? Because there's Ignite processes
Yeah.
and city, where is this grand thing going and what, for the public benefit, but also just because for process, just so people understand there will be an RFP process.
Yep.
I think
Perhaps
that would
what
be,
that
I think
is-
that would be helpful to see, not just kind of the design standards process, but actually the Atlas Corridor project.
No, and I appreciate the comment, because sometimes I wonder if the group gets tired of hearing that, but you guys are not necessarily touching it every single day.
Right.
And so that's why I typically bring forward, and I've got a couple graphics you guys have seen, you know, where did we start it, how are we moving through this? I didn't do that today out of the interest of time, but I appreciate the comment that I will do that next week to provide a broader context of how this fits into the grand plan. And even some comments about the construction on the park and where we're headed with that and whatnot.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Anything else? No? Well, I thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
This one.
Lou, do you have anything else? That's it, right?
Anything else?
That's it for this. If I may, though, can I announce about the pop-up game nights?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have the 3 pop-up game nights that are happening. We have the first one tonight at Silver Lake Mall, starting at 5:30. It'll be in community room, I believe it's 1215, next to the Bath and Body Works. So that'll be that, and we expect it'll be about 2 hours. So it's the same game that the commission played and the same one that happened at the public launch event for our Envision Coeur d'Alene project. Tomorrow night, there will be one at the Human Resources Education Institute, so HREI, and that'll also start at 5:30. And then there will be one next Wednesday, the 13th, at Lake City High School in their kind of common area. So we would like to get a lot of community members there, and if people have played the game before but want to play it again, that'd be great. We're trying to encourage more input. This is really helping guide the process for our consultants, MIG, in looking at how will we grow? How do community members want to see our community move forward to the year 2040?
Great, appreciate that.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. If nothing else,
I'll take a motion to adjourn. 1 second.
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you, appreciate it. Good afternoon.